Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for attending the Blueprint for 21st Century Policing Start With What Works workshop. I hope you all are enjoying the 2017 IACP Annual Conference so far. My name is Kathleen Kelly. I'm a project coordinator for the Institute for Community Police Relations at the IACP. This workshop will help law enforcement leaders start with what works by highlighting recommendations with the strongest base of evidence to support their effectiveness. This workshop features leading experts in law enforcement research fields to discuss and hear your feedback on how academia is partnering with the field and expanding 21st century policing research. Before we get started, I would like to thank the Motorola Foundation for their support and funding with 21st century policing work in the field at Provo, Utah Police Department, Anne Arundel County, Maryland Police Department, Springfield, Vermont, and Elgin, Illinois Police Department. With the assistance from the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy at George Mason University, we produced an evidence assessment of recommendations of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, the Starting With What Works brochure, and the 21st Century Policing Blueprint, which is an interactive online portal that provides strategies and resources with implementation of community policing tactics. I'd like to introduce my panelists to the left. So we have Lori Robinson from George Mason University, Chief Jeff Svoboda from Elgin, Illinois Police Department, and Dr. Robin Engel from the University of Cincinnati and the IACP UC Center for Research and Policy. Lori, if you'd like to start.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm really very pleased to be here this afternoon. I wanted to give you some background about why we undertook the evidence assessment project that this panel was about. I think all of you know that the White House Task Force report on 21st century policing issued a report back in May of 2015. And I had the opportunity, really the honor, to serve as co-chair of that task force along with Chuck Ramsey, who I think all of you know was at that time Commissioner of Police here in Philadelphia. And that task force report was put together on a very fast track at the request of then President Barack Obama. And we did not have any time to do original research to back up the recommendations, but through hearings that we held around the country, we looked to the experience and practices from the field. And we also drew upon existing research. But what we wanted to do in a later document, and Kathleen, do we have copies of that assessment report here?
At the hub.
At the hub. Oh, excellent. Oh, great. So Robin is holding up a copy of that assessment report, which is available at the hub, and it's also available, importantly, online on the IACP website under the Institute for Community Police Relations, because that IACP website is very big, so you have to know kind of where to look for. But we felt that it was important last year, the year before, to put together a document that showed the evidence behind the recommendations in the task force report. Once the task force report was on the street. So John Furman, one of the key staffers at IACP, wanted to help lead the charge in identifying the evidence behind those recommendations as IACP, through the Institute, was working with the field to help in implementation. Because many questions were arising as to how to prioritize implementation of those recommendations and to get some help on some kind of practical roadmap for getting underway with implementation. So John Furman and IACP began discussions with the Laura and John Arnold Foundation and came to George Mason University whereas Kathleen says I'm teaching, and specifically with our Center on Evidence-Based Crime Policy and our director there, Cynthia, about working together to review recommendation by recommendation what the existing research knowledge is about each of the task force recommendations relating to state and local law enforcement. There are 156 recommendations in the report, along with the action items, action recommendations. Of those 156, 87 are specifically directed to the state and local law enforcement side. The remainder are some recommendations for the federal side about funding research, developing statistics, and the like. But the ones that are focused for state and local, the point there was to look and see what research was available in those areas, and then also where there were research gaps. And I know Robin is going to be addressing that arena. So the Arnold Foundation agreed to support a project to help pull that information together. For the project, IACP's Research Advisory Committee, which I co-chair along with Alexandria, Virginia's Police Chief Michael Brown, acted as an advisory project, or advisory group rather, to that project to ensure that we had practitioner input from the field. And IACP's Institute for Community Police Relations, through Jim Baker, who oversees that institute, they were also intimately involved in this project. And Jim, as you may know, was head of state police in Vermont and has come fairly recently from the field. He was really helpful in this whole process and providing his insights to it. So what I want to do now is turn to some of the key findings that I think will be of interest to you as chiefs. If you're already working with the task force report, or if you're perhaps just getting started with it. So I want to run through some of the suggestions under each of the 6 pillars in the report. And because our time constraints are what they are, I'm going to be fairly brief in just picking a few items under each of the 6 pillars. But we've also, through IACP, put together, and Robin, I don't know if you have it, the 6-page brochure that the staff, actually I have a Xerox of it, and I think this is probably available through the IACP hub and on the website as well, which is a good distilled excerpt from the longer publication that summarizes the key points about what works out of the task force report. So this is a very distilled brochure and a what works guide that I commend to you. So jumping in on pillar 1, which focuses on building trust and legitimacy, the evidence-based recommendations there include 3 points. First, promoting procedural justice in interactions with citizens and working on instilling those principles internally within the agency as well by giving officers, as an example, a greater voice. A second point under Pillar 1, wherever possible, recruiting staff who reflect the community's diversity. And third point, implementing annual community surveys to obtain citizen feedback about the department and their feelings about crime in the community and their own safety. So those are, again, 3 points under Pillar 1 that are backed by evidence. Under Pillar 2 on policy and oversight, evidence-based recommendations include adopting clear and comprehensive policies on use of force and making those policies public, and instituting clear policies on handling civil disturbances and demonstrations. Then turning to Pillar 3 on technology and social media, just a few of the evidence-based recommendations here include that police managers in agencies using body-worn cameras should emphasize in training the purpose of cameras, how and under what circumstances the recordings will be used for supervision and discipline, and the potential benefits of body-worn cameras for both officers and civilians. And that agencies should track uses and outcomes associated with cameras, for example, complaints and use of force incidents for officers with and without cameras. A second point under Pillar 3, that agencies should consult with the community when adopting, implementing, and evaluating technology. This is something we heard, by the way, from a number of jurisdictions who testified before us. And third point, that agencies should formulate policies defining acceptable uses of social media. Under Pillar 4 on community policing and crime reduction, evidence-based recommendations include enhancing training on communication, conflict resolution, and de-escalation skills in academy and in-service training protocols. Second point, working with schools, local governments, and communities to implement coordinated evidence-based behavioral support programs in schools to limit the use of criminal justice sanctions like arrest in schools. And this is really to address the so-called school-to-prison pipeline issue. And third point under Pillar 4, examining the agency's commitment to community policing and the tangible strategies used to achieve community policing through a strategic planning and assessment process. Then under Pillar 5, and I know I'm running through these very quickly, Pillar 5 on education and training. The research-based recommendations here include incorporating crisis intervention training, CIT, in both basic recruit and in-service training for officer handling of mentally ill individuals, and implementing implicit or unconscious bias training, which is more effective, research says, than programs focused on explicit bias. And then finally, in Pillar 6 on officer safety and wellness, research-based recommendations include considering shift length and the fact that research shows 10-hour shifts may be healthier for officers than 12-hour shifts, which can increase officer fatigue and affect wellness and police work outcomes. And encouraging officers to take safety measures like using ballistic vests, tactical first aid kits, and seat belts. And backing this up with training, clear written policies, and daily supervision and inspection. So that's, again, a very quick run-through of the research-backed recommendations, not comprehensive because of time. So again, just to wrap up, I'd say that that's the bottom line here, that there's a lot of work I know going on around the country, and this assessment document, I think, provides a very practical tool to help chiefs prioritize in implementing recommendations that can help meet the needs of your department as well as your communities. So I thank you. I look forward to your comments and also to your questions. Thank you, Kathleen.
Next up, we have Chief Swoboda.
All right. Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me a few minutes to talk about this. I was honored to be asked to sit on this panel, obviously with Lori, who was the co-chair of 21st Century Policing and putting that document together, and then as well with Robin, who has just a ton of information and knowledge on how we actually assess where we're at in that document as a nation and law enforcement as a whole. And so what I was asked to do was just talk a little bit about the actual, kind of what does it look like from the field as a police chief and looking at the document and assessing the department that I work for and seeing, how we stacked up. And as part of this, nobody likes to sit through a session where a police chief comes and brags about all the things they're doing. So that's not what this is meant to do. But I'm going to go through the 6 pillars in a moment and talk about some of the things that we're doing that have been successful, but then also some of the challenges that come with each one of those. But I was blessed to enter the Elgin Police Department. Elgin's about a half hour or so west of Chicago. And if you go to O'Hare Airport, fly into Chicago, you're just about in Elgin. You're probably about 20 minutes away from Elgin. And it's about 115,000 people, 182 police officers, and I've been there for 25 years. And I was lucky enough to come in under Chief Chuck Gruber, who was actually the president of IACP a long time ago. And he introduced the idea of community-oriented policing, and so I was one of those officers that came in, and it's just all I've ever known. So I've been in policing now for 25 years in the same department, and it really does make a difference when you come in and see that it's the entire top-down, all the way down to every other officer working on it. And so what we're doing now, again, a big part of that is because it was put in place, and it's not always just to the credit of the current police chief, but really the generations that have gone before me with it. So as I go through each one of these, again, I just want to hit on what we have done that works and some of the challenges. Under building legitimacy and trust, there's everyone's doing a lot of the outreach with the Coffee with a Cop and the neighborhood meetings, and now procedural justice, obviously a very hot topic that many are going through. Some of the things that we did that were a little bit different as well, and we're really trying to get the legitimacy, seeing the things going around the country, was doing a use of force presentation. Obviously, every department's not created equal with the amount of training that they are afforded, the type of training that they have, the training facilities, all of those things, and the equipment that the officers carry. So what we did is we made it very Elgin-centric. Everything that the Elgin Police Department, so in Elgin, Illinois, so we went through Illinois state law, what gives officers the right to use force. But then going through to show what our training program is, how officers are brought in, and then actually the types of equipment that officers have, that they have the various levels of force options, that they don't just have to go from pepper spray to a handgun, that there are other options that we have. And so we spent a lot of time touring the city to talk about, at the various neighborhood groups, here's what use of force looks like in Elgin, talking about the types of force we've used, giving the actual numbers, going into things, lawsuits, excessive use of force, all of those things. And that was one of the things that really paid dividends. We went into high school, and we were invited by the principal to come in and talk about this with juniors and seniors, about just use of force in general. So that was something that really helped us out a lot. The other thing that we've done a lot of is have community conversations on some very tough issues. And so Elgin's about 50% Hispanic. And so we've had multiple conversations dealing with immigration. And then especially in the past year where it's really been a hot topic, having the trust of our community, our city manager, the council and mayor, to make sure that people knew they could come out and ask questions. And we didn't always know exactly what the answers were going to be. It wasn't necessarily a safe conversation to have as far as from the police department, because we knew there'd be some tough questions. What are you going to do in this situation? And I could say what I was going to do as the police chief. Obviously, the council could change that at any time. And then there were some various laws that were being passed as well, not just in Illinois, but across the country, different laws that are coming into effect. But the fact we came out there and had conversations, they were done all in Spanish. Many of them, we've done multiple ones, but some of them were done all in Spanish. And we just allowed people to come in and talk and say what we absolutely are not going to do and what we are going to do regarding immigration. So it was just it was a real conversation that really pushed the ball, I believe, down the field for us with input, with trustworthiness, people understanding it, not watching TV and getting them fed what's going to happen, because again, Elgin is different from other cities within Illinois and cities across the United States. So we thought it was really important to talk about exactly what our residents of Elgin could expect when they come across an Elgin police officer. And what was really important is just the idea that they need to hear it from the chief. The mayors are great and can talk about certain things. City council members can, carry the water on some of these things as well, but there was nothing that I found, and the feedback that I got from the community was that it was most important, it had the biggest effect, that the chief of police was out there saying what's going to happen, giving out a cell phone number to say if you're hearing anything different is happening, you can call. You can call and we will answer and we will go and investigate. And there were some false allegations. With social media, that's one of the challenges I'll get to in a moment. But with social media, there were many reports of this type of act, Elgin Police Department is doing this on this road, or is doing some type of, quote unquote, was on social media, a roundup of people at workplaces and things like that. So we were able to quickly have people we were able to get the facts out when there was bad information out there. And if we didn't have these community conversations, I don't believe we would have had those. As Lori said, we're pressed with time, so I'm going to go kind of quickly through each one of the 6. That was the first pillar, one of the things we did. Policy oversight. Obviously, unions have a lot to say and what type of oversight there can be. And state law, there's a lot of different things that go on across the country. One of the things that we did was create a citizen advisory committee that has zero authority as far as with discipline, but it was extremely helpful when we would change the officers. Again, there has to be a lot of trust with this, but the officers understand that I bring forward, especially when there are some controversial types of allegations, where we change the names, change a little bit of exactly what happened, and explain to the Citizen Advisory Committee, what would you all do in this type of situation? It's a very diverse group. Some are pro-police, some are in the middle, others are clearly questioning the police and the authority the police have, and we'd give out the facts, and what we were finding is many times the citizens were much more lenient than we were as a police department. Again, it was something that really pushed the ball down that said, well, actually in this case that officer got suspended for a day or 2 days, and many times they were very surprised, again, because the narrative that many hear is when someone complains, nothing is done. And that's a narrative that's probably true in some places, but what we were continuously pushing is, you can hear all these things about what's going on around the country, but everything I talk about is about Elgin. And I can say, if that case happened here, here's how we would handle it in Elgin. But I'm reading it from the internet, I'm reading it from the paper as well. I can't comment on what exactly occurred in this other city. I don't have all the facts. But what we do is talk about the facts that are the things that are occurring in our town. And we talk about the policies we have, the procedures we have. And again, it was just another thing that really pushed us forward with the whole idea of policy and oversight. The technology and social media, obviously a lot of good and bad that comes with it, and working with the press as well. And one of the things that we changed is just a way we talk. And we don't do press releases anymore. We do community notifications. And again, it might sound like a silly thing, but there's a lot of things we notify the community about that the press may pick it up or they may not. And so we no longer say that we are giving a press release out. We do a lot of community notifications. Many of those community notifications, the press picks up and says, hey, we want more information, and they eventually do a story. But again, it starts off as we tell the community all of these things in addition to the press. And so it was just kind of these semantic things that were going on that really, again, helped to assist us in that and being very proactive. Case in point, that's something that's going on right now. There was information that we had that there might be a theft occurring within made the paper, so within the police union. And the information was brought to us. And knowing how things go nowadays, we knew that at some point the press was going to hear about it probably that day. At some point we were going to be getting a call. And so we let the union know that we were going to be putting that out ourselves. But that day we did a very short community notification that just says we were given information that there's a potential theft that has occurred, and we have opened up a criminal investigation. We've opened up an investigation into the matter, and if there's merit to it, we will talk about it. Of course, the press called, and we said that's pretty much all we have. We knew going into it that there was probably, where there was smoke, there was some fire, and so we were going to probably find something. But those were the kind of things that a lot of the feedback, even from the press, was saying, I can't believe you guys put that out yourselves. That says a lot about what you're doing. And so, again, we know that all these things are going to get out. With social media, everything eventually gets out. And we thought if we're going to continue to push the good things, here's an officer playing basketball with the kids, we're going to talk about things where officers do negative things, do bad things, do potentially criminal things. And again, many times officers don't necessarily like that. but we're very open even with our officers and go and, I'll talk a little bit about procedural justice and making sure officers have voice, but that's also that, it's not the chief of police that's going to explain bad conduct by officers. I'm quite honestly tired of talking about why an officer did something that's inappropriate or potentially illegal, and we many times have officers come in and talk with community groups. We had an officer get into something not too long ago, and it was a hot topic on social media, and that officer was ordered to come to our next coffee with a cop, and he could sit there. And if there were questions that were asked about what was going on, he's right here. Because like many of you, I'm tired of trying to explain why certain things happen. Now, many times it's up to the chief to put context into things, and it's not that I'm just shirking my responsibility, but clearly when there are some inappropriate actions by an officer, is to the best you can, and again, there's issues sometimes potentially with unions and discipline and all those things, but we make sure that officers will be there to answer the questions about their conduct. Moving on quickly, for community policing and crime reduction, everyone's really trying to work on to this whole idea of youth engagement. That's obviously a big issue right now. It's always been an issue, but everyone's really working on it. And one of the things we did, as many others, again, have done many of these things, has really been about the idea of a listening session, talking with teens, putting together the same thing we have with the Citizen Advisory Council. We have a Teen Advisory Council that deals with many of these same things. And it's not just about discipline. It's about when we were rolling out body cameras. We were lucky to get the Department of Justice grant to have body cameras. So we have all body cameras throughout our entire police department. And, we talk with the kids and we talk with the adults and say, here's what our policy says. Here's what it shows. The idea of when an officer can turn it off and turn it on is obviously a hot topic. And so we talked about those things in the front. And we do a lot of that with the Citizen Advisory. And the one point that I want to hit on with the community policing, Elgin, it's really kind of been the stake on one of the footholds we've had in the communities. We have something called the Resident Officer Program. And for a while I was a resident officer when I first came in, and that's a police officer who lives in the neighborhood. The city pays for an apartment or a house, and that officer makes their own hours, has a squad car. He's expected to work when there's issues going on. That could be after school issues. It could be drug issues at 3 o'clock in the morning. That officer's responsible for reducing crime, improving the quality of life, and it's up to them on what they do. And so that's really helped us. At one point we had 9 resident officers. Now it's down to 4. It's kind of a fluid number depending on areas that need additional attention, that we have this resident officer program. So we already have a really good foothold in with the youth in our community, and that's really through the resident officer program especially. And then the last 2, training and education. We used to have 196 police officers. Again, now we're down to 182. And again, this year we didn't put in for more police officers. My council sometimes you see, and it hasn't happened with this because quite honestly I won't allow it to happen, where the push for more police officers, but not the need for additional money to go along with that for training. And so what we have pushed, and I will continue to say, is we'll have less police officers and respond to less calls for service if we have to, and more training than having more police officers with less training. I think far too often we're putting officers in bad situations. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the training. And so we'll continue to say, I don't want more police officers unless there is additional money that's coming with that as well. The proper equipment, as I talked about, obviously CIT. And then finally, officer wellness and safety. We started a physical fitness program, and with that, it's a voluntary program. But we really started pushing, like many have. We put a gym in the basement, and we didn't allow police officers to work out on duty when I became chief. I don't know if I mentioned, I've been chief for 8 years, but we didn't allow police officers to work out on duty. And it always bugged me that a police officer could go to McDonald's, not picking on McDonald's, but go through any fast food, come back to the station, watch TV, and eat their fast food. But if they wanted to quickly eat a salad and go and walk on a treadmill lightly for a half hour, we couldn't do that because that was considered working out on duty. And so we loosened that up, said officers can now work out on duty. They have to be prepared where they could respond quickly, so they can't completely change. But if they want to do a light walking or something like that, so it's a physical fitness program. And now we're up over 50, believe we're approaching 60% of our officers volunteer to take that. If they eventually pass it, I always call it they get a day off. I call it their doctor day. Everyone's too busy to go to the doctor every year, at least in our minds. And so we remind officers that that's the day you should make your appointment to go see your doctor. That's your doctor day. and they get a stipend as well of, I think now it's $400. And so we're hoping that that'll continue to show as we're getting more and more people. Again, we passed 100 police officers out of 182 that have taken voluntarily the test. From myself and my entire command staff takes the test, and again, kind of trying to lead by example. But the final one that we're pushing starting in January is a mental fitness program. And what that is, if someone goes and sees a counselor on their own time 4 times, once each quarter, at the end of the year, we're going to follow the same type of suit where they get the day off, and we're still working on whether or not a stipend will come with that as well. So we're really trying to push this whole idea with mental fitness, physical fitness, again, this engagement with the community, and the 21st Century Police, and all of those recommendations and the 6 pillars, like everybody, we broke it out, saw that we were doing some very well, but saw that we needed to do a little bit more with the oversight and some other, we had some other challenges as well with the social media, the constant 24/7 on social media, bad information. When do you respond to bad information on social media? Because then you're responding constantly. So those are some of the challenges we're working through. But the 21st Century Policing, that guideline and the subsequent one with the, that I know Robin's going to hit on here in a little bit, has been extremely helpful. And I look forward to the questions as well. And again, this was just kind of meant to say some of the things we're doing in Elgin, and if there's some people that can kind of replicate them, great. But we've taken many of those ideas that we're doing from maybe some of you actually sitting out there today. So I look forward if there are any questions at the end, but thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Chief. Dr. Rogman-Engel.
Good afternoon. I'm waiting for the PowerPoint to magically present itself. There we go. I am Robin Engel, and by way of introduction, it was spring of 2015 when I first started engaging with IACP, and they were talking about putting together a research center. They had received funding from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, and the idea was to bring and create something where there was research opportunities for law enforcement and that they could disseminate widely and broadly to the field. And it sounded like exactly the type of thing that I would be incredibly interested in. And so we began those talks about me serving as the director of this new research center. And then in the summer of 2015, as those talks continued, what happened at the University of Cincinnati is something that's happened, unfortunately, in many of our communities, and that is we had an officer who was involved in a shooting of an unarmed black male, white officer, campus police officer off campus. And that incident at the University of Cincinnati, I was a faculty member there and working with law enforcement. I've been trained as a researcher and been a researcher all my adult life. And they came to me and said, you work with law enforcement around the country. You talk about implementing best practices. We have a crisis here, and we would like you to take operational control of this police department and work on a reform effort and work with our community. When that happened and I took on that additional assignment, at the same time, the research center with IACP was moving forward too. So I found myself with 2 jobs. I bring this to your attention only because I now have an entirely new perspective as a researcher of what it really means to implement those best practices and evidence-based approaches. So now what we're trying to do with the Research Center is really make it an opportunity for you, our law enforcement consumers, to be able to use it in a more friendly way and really be able to take that research back and implement it into your agencies, but also so that you can become those organizations that become learning organizations and you can actually implement research yourself. So we're just getting started with this work, and we have been thinking through what this means. What we found actually is that researchers, we encourage law enforcement officials across the country to promote these evidence-based practices, and we insist science should be used to inform police strategies, policies, procedures, and training. I think many folks in the room can agree with that sentiment. We want to be data-driven and evidence-based. But the conflict is, how much do we actually know? How much research is actually out there that we can then bring back to our law enforcement community? And then of the research that is there, how can we disseminate that knowledge and really make it usable, not just for law enforcement executives, but for the officers on the beat and on the street? And so those are the types of things we've been looking at and thinking about the challenge before us. So the challenge is we have a growing body of research, but there are these enormous gaps and information that we don't have. How do we fill those gaps, and how do we better disseminate evidence-based practices and promote their adoption? But what I suggest to you today is that we can think about this as a challenge, or we can think about it as an opportunity. Because truly, the opportunity before us is bringing science to the streets. This is a time in the law enforcement community where we can begin to provide agencies with this access to cutting-edge research. We can translate that into actionable recommendations, and we can continue to conduct, facilitate that police research. We can work to foster relationships with academics and our police agencies and give direct access to the field. Because after all, what we're really striving here for with the center at IACP is to have research that's driven by law enforcement for law enforcement. And so when we do this, as I mentioned, we have the Laura and John Arnold Foundation graciously funded this center, and we're working and thinking about folks in the audience as both producers of knowledge and consumers of knowledge. And so as a producer of knowledge, you have agencies, you're in charge of agencies where you can think about that as a laboratory, as an opportunity to inform not just what your agency should be doing moving forward, but what the field should be doing moving forward. So you have this opportunity to produce knowledge. But you also have an opportunity to be a consumer of knowledge. And what we want to do at the center is to help facilitate that by bringing that knowledge into something that's manageable. The worst part is sending your staff out on a wild goose chase and saying, find out about this. And a week later, they come back exasperated because there's so much information out there, and what should we be doing? This one says this, but this research piece says that. So thinking through how we can really compile that together and be the one-stop shop, the first place that you look for where you want to go for research guidance. And so that's the type of thing that we're working on at the center. We have 3 specific deliverables that we've been working on, and the first is a model policy that we've put together to guide police academic partnerships. Now, this model policy is now available at IACP, and you can download it here on our website. And that model policy is actually a guide for agencies that want to partner with an academic institution, for instance, or a research partner, but maybe you're not quite sure the ins and outs of what to do. We're going to be posting model MOUs and other things. One of the things that we know when you partner with an academic institution, it has to be very clear what you're seeking and what they're seeking, and making sure that those expectations are being met on both ends. We're also working on a series of systematic literature reviews, and what this is to draw all the information that's out there and put it into one nice, neat little package for law enforcement officials. So de-escalation training is one of the things, of course, that the task force recommended. What do we really know about de-escalation training? Is it effective? What are the core principles that should be included in de-escalation training? We're also pulling together the research on crisis intervention teams, violence against police, and the Violence Against Police Task Force that IACP has set up. That's something that we'll be talking about actually tomorrow. And then also attitudes towards police. This is just the beginning, the first few topics that we're taking on, but we'll be continuing this work moving forward. The other thing that we're working on is being producers of knowledge as well. So we're doing our own research studies, and we're partnering with agencies to provide that cutting-edge research. So for instance, we have a violence reduction initiative that is just kicking off with the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. We have a domestic violence reduction strategy that's being implemented with the Tulsa Police Department. We're also working with agencies and looking through implicit bias training evaluations, de-escalation training evaluations, and if there's any police chief out there who thinks, gosh, I really wish I could get involved in that, you need to take my card, because there's lots of opportunities. And these research resources are actually free because they're funded by the Arnold Foundation, and so this is something we can provide to your agency at no cost. We're also looking at investigations, case closure studies, examining police-citizen encounters, And I'm actually most excited about our agency case study series. So this is something where we're telling your stories. So if you have something that's happening in your jurisdiction, or you've looked over time and you seem to feel like there's something to this, there's something successful that's happening here, we'll come in with our research team, look back through your data, interview your staff, and find out what was it that was working, write that up into a case series, or a case study, and we'll put that information back out there so that we can disseminate those stories more systematically to the field. What can your agency do to integrate research and promote these evidence-based policies? Well, it's really important to create and support learning institutions. I listened to Simon Sinek for the second time when he spoke at opening ceremonies, and I was just as thrilled the second time as I was the first. And what I learned, of course, was creating that vulnerable organization. Well, what you could do, law enforcement executives, right now today is think about how you can create and support a learning organization so that you're testing your own ideas. You don't need an outside researcher to be able to do that. It doesn't have to be the best, most rigorous, methodologically sound study in order to have impact in your own agency. But if you do want to take that extra step, you can develop police academic partnerships. And every organization, you know someone somewhere that's connected with perhaps an academic institution or a research think tank, somewhere out there, and we can help you facilitate those partnerships. We have so much available resources. How you access and use those resources, I think, is going to be critically important for you moving forward. And then, of course, have the opportunity to engage with us directly. But one of the things I want to remind you of, and why I was asked to speak today, was about the gaps in research that already exist. And I mentioned to you Cynthia Lum and her colleagues, I'm pointing to it, the recommendations that they have with the evidence assessment. And what they found, and I'll make this PowerPoint available to you, it's just a summary of each of the gaps in research for each of the pillars. But I'll just highlight for you, in the interest of time, just a couple for you to keep in mind. So with building trust and legitimacy, one of the things that we really want to know is, does training in procedural justice, implicit bias, does it have that intended impact? I remember back in the 1990s, you might recall too, when we were really talking about racial profiling, and the answer to racial profiling was diversity training. How many of you had officers that had to go through a series of diversity training and racial bias training? And what we found after we did all of that additional training was that the racial disparities in traffic stops, searches, and arrests remained across the country. What was it that we missed there? Was the training not effective? Did it not touch the outcomes we were anticipating? Why 2 decades later do we still have the same racial disparities despite the training that we gave all of our officers? So we don't want to repeat those same mistakes. And when we're thinking about our training, and particularly in implicit bias and procedural justice, we want to make sure that that training is having the impact that we intend. Policy and oversight gaps here. Thinking this through just for a moment, how is your policy guided by research? Is it? When you're making policy changes and looking at use of force, for instance, policy changes, are you guiding that by research, or are you looking to other agencies and just copying the model policy that they have? So that's something to think about. Also, internal and external oversight mechanisms. What works the best and why? Those are the types of things that we want to continue researching and understand. Our gaps in technology and social media. What are the unintended consequences of the use of body-worn cameras? We know what the benefits are, but what are those unintended consequences? And before we outfit entire agencies with body cameras, do we really understand what those unintended consequences are and how we're going to mitigate those to move forward? We can also think about crime prevention and crime reduction. What are the best strategies for implementing and ingraining community policing within particular agencies? And thinking through the different strategies that are used, we have a research base that exists, but there's still these finite, interesting, very definitive questions that need to be answered so that we can better guide researchers. Finally, actually not finally, 6 pillars. You always throw me off, Lori. I thought there were 5, but there are 6. Training and education. Additional research, and I already stressed this, but I want to say it one more time. We need research in every area of training that was discussed by the task force, because that is the largest gap that we have in research. And if you think it through as law enforcement executives, we always resort to training, because training is the #1 foundation. That is what we're doing for our people. And imagine that we have an entire field where we are training officers and not testing effectively if that training works. So that is something that we need to correct. And the folks in this room can start that work. You can start it right in your agency and working with your own training academies to make that happen. Safety and wellness, a huge issue, of course. What are the most effective wellness programs? What's working? We know that we've heard anecdotally of things that work, but let's test them systematically so that we can have the most healthy officers and ones that are, of course, enjoy their job and the organization that they work for. So in conclusion, I do think that there's great opportunity before us. We have an opportunity to foster evidence-based profession and really move this field in significant ways. We do have a growing body of research that can guide policy and practice. We have extensive resources that are currently available and more that are being developed every day. But I think this is the most important part, I'll suggest to you, is that I have seen and noticed over the last number of years a dramatic change in police culture to one that's starting to embrace new approaches, being willing to test ideas and to share those findings. I see it as really a sea change in law enforcement that's happening right now. And police executives like yourselves that are sitting right here in this room, you have the opportunity to keep that momentum and move us forward so that the entire profession becomes one that's evidence-based and data-driven. What you can also do is help us by following our work and contact us to join our team. Partner up with us. We'd love to come to your jurisdiction, to your hometown, and see what resources we could provide to you as well. So thank you for your time.
Now it's time for some questions. So if you in the audience have any questions for our panelists here, we'd love to hear it. Don't all step out at once.
Yeah, I'll go. My name is Jeff Lindsay. I'm with the University of Tennessee Law Enforcement Innovation Center. So we're tracking very closely in terms of our programs, the blueprint, and moving forward. I was at an accountability panel earlier today, and Chief Buckner from Little Rock, Arkansas, had a very interesting point. And while the onus is on the police agencies and departments to take those steps to reach further across the aisle, so to speak, for engagement and building trust, he had a very important point, I think, that is lost on us sometimes. And he says the community must be engaged, and there needs to be a proof of effort on the part of the community. So that's probably more art than science. Chief, you've probably had those tough discussions with community leaders. Any observations on how agencies making good faith efforts and then can not turn around and task the community to show that they're involved, but to encourage that to where the community steps up, or at least makes more visible steps of stepping up instead of just pot-shotting or bringing out the bad points of what the agency's doing or not doing?
Yeah, so, excuse me, what we've really been working on is making sure that we have plenty of opportunities for the community to come forward in. And then realistically, yeah, I agree, and it would be great if more of the community got involved, prior to an incident or, prior, not having a specific concern, but just in general wanting to help the police department get better. But what I look at, and while I don't disagree with the point, what I look at from the police department, it's my job to go out and do that. And you can make an argument, how far does the community have to go on their nights off to come in and get involved? But myself and the police officers that work there and the civilians that work in the police department get paid to do something. And so we continuously are out there. We've had coffee with the cops and other engagements. We did the use of force one time with, I think there were 4 people in the room. And it's an hour-and-a-half presentation, but again, we put it out on social media that, again, we were out here doing our use of force presentations so that at any point we can always say, this past week there were 3 opportunities to get involved with your police department. Last week there were 5 opportunities. And we keep track of that. We keep reminding the community that if there's ever a concern, I have to leave tonight because tomorrow morning we have it's called a meeting with the chief every month, or once a month on a Monday night, meet with the chief. But that was just last week, we had a coffee with a cop. So we just keep having multiple opportunities, and if nobody shows up, or if very few people show up, then we still run with it, and we just publicize that you missed a chance if you have an issue.
Of course.
I'd add that at the hearings we held around the country, we did hear a lot of strategies that came out. And Ron Davis is here, and he could jump in on this too, from COPS, formerly from COPS, but of chiefs who encountered a lot of resistance, but as the chief here is saying, just continued to go out and hold listening sessions, not necessarily talking sessions, but just listening sessions. Another strategy was the use, particularly by younger members of the force, younger officers, of social media. That a lot of younger members of the community are so used to using social media all the time that the use by the department of social media was a good way to connect with members of the community. And we heard Seattle being one example, is a department that has become very adept at connecting with community members via social media. So the kind of creative approaches, but that one thing that was true in common was that all of it took time. But I think the question that your colleague had raised was a good one. It's an investment of time.
Thank you. Any more questions? All right. I'd like to thank our panelists one last time. Thank you all for coming.